I'm going to speak a little bit about the work that I've been involved in and the work that we've been doing at OxFID International around leveraging the private sector and increasingly leveraging markets to improve the opportunities for poor people, right, for them to engage and benefit from markets. So I'll speak a little bit about where we come from in terms of types of programs that development partners have been funding. What have we learned? So there's an evolution. There's a constant, very dynamic environment in which we're operating within. Even within my short career, we've seen a lot of different approaches that have been piloted by donors, development agencies on how can they reduce poverty, how can they increase opportunities for poor people, how can they increase incomes for poor people. So I'll sort of quickly run through some of our experience. So first off, I think I'd roll it back to what can we do to try to stimulate economic growth in these emerging conflict, post-conflict countries. Really simply, the starting point was for a lot of development partners was, well, what can we do to create jobs? And they would sort of roll back to say, well, actually, small business are the catalyst of most job creation in most countries. So what can we do to stimulate small business? And so you have a lot of programs that were pushed out around supporting entrepreneurship. What can you do to leverage people's skills and assets to drive business growth? And then you take a step back saying, right, okay, we can try to stimulate entrepreneurs, but what they really need is an ecosystem that supports their growth. So you then had programs that were being pushed out to try to create sort of business development services, support ecosystems for entrepreneurs. And these are in developing countries. So you have this sort of business development services. There was the ILO was very actively involved, the World Bank. And then you start to, as you get into addressing some of these issues, you realize, well, there's another issue that we have to solve here. Okay, you can try to identify entrepreneurs, you can try to support them, but what a lot of these entrepreneurs need is capital. So what can we do to stimulate SMME finance? And then you start to uncover additional challenges that businesses face and say, right, the real problem in these places is that the business environment is so hostile towards small business, and you have huge informal sectors and very, very small formal sectors, so that they then sort of preclude themselves from being able to access these things. So then you start to realize, well, you've got all of these challenges that are facing small business growth. Concurrently, you had a theory of change which said, right, the way in which we will generate growth in these countries is through FDI. Bring in capital, bring in expertise. What can we do to stimulate growth in these countries? And so then there was this focus around this wider investment climate within each of these countries. What can each of these governments do to improve their investment climate? And you still see a lot of attention being placed on this. The World Bank, they're doing business report annually. A lot of it is around how can they influence the investment climate in each of these countries. So that's been a big focus. And additionally, then say, right, okay, you can try to address sort of the business environment, investment climate issues for big business, but some of these countries are just they're just too risky. So where can we generate large sums of risk capital to go into these places? And each of these areas have their own stream of programming in a completely parallel universe. And from The Economist, were people working out at a community level, saying, all right, these are poor people who are out in rural areas, they're struggling with their day-to-day needs, and you had programs which were driven around community development, and then looking, an extension of that to say, right, actually what people need are livelihoods. Right? How do they increase their income? So you had this program around rural livelihoods, and that focused on agriculture. And it was almost as if these were parallel universes. You had people who were focused at the macro level, the SMME level, and then at the rural level. And in the last 5 years, I've seen, and there's been a convergence between these types of approaches, which is, so what have we learned in 15, 20 years? It's more complex. Than you think you can just sort of pick off one issue, and you can, often go, it hasn't proven that simple. So we're seeing a convergence between all of these approaches. Now programs are really focused on inclusive economic growth. Because what we've seen here is, right, if you get this going, well, how do you ensure that actually this large investments in garment sector or large investment in mining, how's that going to reduce poverty? How's that going to create incomes for poor people? So there's a recognition and a realization that economic growth is one thing, inclusive growth is another. And a lot of the programs and the focus of development partners is now around inclusive growth. Right? So how can you ensure that growth leads to poverty reduction? You can't assume that anymore. And maybe people didn't always assume that, but I think there was a degree, an assumption being made by development partners. Now, so all of this is wrapped now into a systems approach. Right? So you say, right, what can we do to leverage and improve the position of poor people within markets? And that's where a lot of the programs have gone in the last 5 years. So you look at what are the underlying constraints in each of these markets, what are the unrealized opportunities in markets. The programs now try to influence, how markets function. So what are the relationships like within these markets? What's the position and power of poor people in these markets? Ultimately, what we've been trying to do over the last 5 years in almost all of our programs has been around influencing behavioral change. Whether in governments to try to improve the business environment, or in the private sector to get them to realize that implementing a different business model is profitable for them, but also will benefit poor people in the markets in which they operate. So that's sort of what we've been focused on now, market systems development. Currently we're implementing, I think probably over a dozen programs around the world, lots of different issues that we're trying to address. So this is just a snapshot of the things that we work on. So it's there's still a lot to learn. We're still learning a lot. Ultimately, the way that development partners assess how successful programs are on our ability to attribute income change to poor people. So I would say, you can look at the macroeconomics, but you can't take that for granted in terms of being able to draw those macroeconomic indicators to poverty reduction, to actual incomes for poor people. I can give a few examples, and I'm happy to sort of speak about some of this maybe during the questions. We're working on a program in the DRC. It's a large program funded by DFID. And what we've seen in the DRC is, the market used to work. It used to work 50 years ago where you had these trader outposts, and these outposts would be moving goods, agriculture goods from the interior into the urban markets. And that's just, over time, that market stopped functioning. So the work that we've been doing there is really to almost rebuild, a trading infrastructure. And farmers in Equator province in the north, they became so discouraged on their ability to benefit from markets that they've actually stopped producing. So the availability of land is huge. The terrain, the rain-fed agriculture in that area is potentially very profitable. But they've been discouraged because they would take their goods to the river, and there wouldn't be anyone there to take their goods. And then even if someone was there, they became a price taker. So they were very disempowered because they knew, the riverboat operators knew that they weren't going to take their goods away, so I could pay as little as I could get away with. So there's, the work that you do on this type of intervention is, trying to understand, map out what's a new business model, and how can we get people to operate in a new business environment. So the work that we were doing was largely with traders, looking at aggregation points, riverboat operators. So how can we make this more profitable for riverboat operators and for traders? If we can make this system work more effectively for riverboat operators, they will buy more goods and farmers will be able to sell their products. And that's sort of what we've been seeing. So there's some interesting case studies that we've seen there. Soybeans in Malawi is another, I can speak on each of these for but what we've seen there is a very small intervention in trying to improve the availability of inoculant, which is a sort of treatment that you can supply on seeds, we're seeing a 8-fold increase on yields for farmers with a really small investment. And so basically, so why wasn't that inoculant available? And it was, where was the private sector in this space? So encouraging the private sector into this space, and demonstrating the value of this product to farmers. And so we've seen some, I think at least in the first couple of years, 50, 60,000 farmers increasing their incomes solely on the use of a real small investment in inputs. And then, another area in which we've been doing quite a bit of work is in Nigeria around tax, and being able to improve public-private dialogue around business environment issues has had a huge effect on people, both in terms of the government's ability to generate revenue, but also the confidence of the private sector to engage in markets and participate in changing the dynamic between the state and people. So a lot of interesting things we can talk about. I think I would broadly say, what we've seen in the last 15 years of let's say economic growth programming is a recognition of it's far more complex. There are far more issues that influence incomes for poor people, and so you have to take a really dynamic approach. So the things that are now appearing, a lot of work around behavioral change. So that's a big area of interest for us. Behavioral change, complex systems, and adaptive sort of programming. So I'll stop there.